Welcome to the Body Smart Podcast, where we remove roadblocks to fitness and health to empower you to master your health habits. We help you become body smart. So the way that I came about this topic was I was actually just talking with a friend this morning, and he came in and he said, we were actually going to talk about something else, but he said, "Oh man, I have this thing that keeps flaring up. Like it happens in different areas, and I'm just not quite sure what what it's all about. Like what's going on. Like I just every so often I'll have a flare up in my foot or in my knee, and oh the knee one really hurt, and or it'll be in my elbow, and he said so my wife wants me to go to the doctor and figure out what's going on, and so." We talked about it a little bit more and kind of what are some of the things that are happening and what are maybe some of the factors that are leading to this happening again and again and in different areas. And so it was actually really good to go through and talk about this because I think that's when we get injured or we have pain or something happens, like where did this come from? Like what's going on? And it's an inconvenience and it's annoyance and what actually like how can I keep this from happening in the future? And obviously like sometimes just injuries happen, stuff pops up. But thinking about some of the principles behind what goes into an injury can be really helpful for avoiding that. And then when something pops up, problem solving. And so I brought up to him the idea that injuries are a lot like storms. And by that, I mean so we talked about what causes storms, right? It's not just one thing. There's a lot of different things that go into, a storm front moving through. Things like temperature, humidity, topography of the land, if there's, how much particulate matter is in there, right? You can see things like fires changing weather patterns. And so there's a lot of factors that go into when we actually get a storm and how much rain we get or how much snow or if we get any severe weather, right? There's all these different things leading to that happening. And so in the same way, that happens with injury, right? That's why we talk about the 5 patterns so much, right? How is your sleep? What's your eating like? What's your activity like? How are you managing stress, right? Are you finding opportunities to cultivate gratitude? Because all of those are different factors that play into how our body's handling different things, right? And whether we're recovering well or not. And so it was really interesting to talk about some of those things with him. He said, "Oh, I wonder if I don't know if what I ate had anything to do with it, but I did notice that since this thing's flared up, like I've been eating different than I normally do, right? I added in more of this and I did, XYZ. Not by intention, it just happened. And then he said, I asked him about his sleep. He said, you know what? It's actually been pretty bad. And by pretty bad I mean horrific. Like it's not been great and I've had some congestion going on, and I wake up and my nose is all stuffy and I just feel gross and I can't get back to sleep right away, and then I don't sleep as well." And he said, I hadn't thought about that. And I've just been thinking about this now that we're talking, and when this flares up, like, I also noticed that it's usually around the time that I traveled, right? I just traveled somewhere. Um, and then another one of the things that we talked about is what's his training like? And he'd just been doing a lot more volume, right? Between boxing, between strength training, and some other workouts. He'd just been doing a lot, and so he was able to step back and say, "Yeah." So now that I'm thinking about this, almost every time this one of these body areas flares up, it's oh I'm training a lot more usual, or I've changed something in my training. Sleep isn't great. I traveled somewhere, or maybe I'm a little bit sick. And so it was really cool to have him have that aha moment. But what was really interesting is a lot of times we think that there's just It's this one thing that I may be doing, right? Or oh, I have a flare up in this area. And it's not that that area is like I've got a bad ankle or I've got a bad knee. It's just that these factors tend to align, and so sometimes it really is kind of creating the perfect storm for injury, right? These all these things line up again, and then bam, I get injured, and bam, I get injured. And so sometimes what we take away from that is again that idea of oh, I've just got that bad area, or it's got a flare up when really it isn't so much the body part or area, it's just what is this combination of factors that tends to leave me in this situation. And so, we talked about that and what are some ways to modify and to avoid. And so really, I think the second step is after noticing, right, like, oh, I'm injured or I tend to get injured, is getting curious about that. Um, what what is happening with the 5 patterns. So I'm going to show a little graphic really quick, and there's going to be a lot going on, but I'm using it to just kind of uh, talk a little bit more to this point of all these different factors. So this is, we call this a web of determinants. You don't need to remember that at all, not relevant. But this is looking at ACL injury in a basketball player and then in a ballet player. And so what you'll notice is that there's some of the same factors, right? And again, you don't need to remember any of the specific constituents, but we got knee valgus over here. Here it's a smaller component, right? It's still in there. And so the different factors that go into an injury, right, between person to person, injury to injury, they're not all going to be the same. And they'll also have different weights. You'll notice the dark circles around some of these and then the dotted lines, right? So this is a bigger factor in the injury. This is a bigger factor in the injury. And then these are kind of strong connections and then a little bit weaker of connections. And so the interaction and interplay of all of these is actually what results in the injury in the end. And sometimes, right, we have a good idea of what are the different factors or what are some of the risks. But sometimes it's just like, yeah, we're not entirely sure, right? There's often an unknown. But if we can start to address some of these different factors, we can reduce the risk of getting that type of injury, right? If anxiety is going in, right? Can we find ways to reduce our anxiety? Um, only so we can't reverse our age, right? So some of these are more fixed, but other ones, right? Training load. Am I doing too much too fast, or can I regulate that in a different way? Fatigue, right? What are ways that I can reduce fatigue? And so there's just all sorts of things that go into it. And so addressing the things that we can address and working on bolstering those areas. Okay, Terry, let's see. I notice a difference in pain, not necessarily injury, when I eat certain foods. It's interesting to think about these other areas. And so that I think that is such an interesting point. And that's actually this will go we'll get into that area in a second, right? But experimenting with different things can be really helpful. The first step is just an awareness, right? Like something's going on, I keep getting injured, I keep getting pain, whatever it is. And then getting curious about that, right? How am I doing in the 5 patterns? How is my sleep? Am I eating in a way to fuel myself well for recovery, for activity, right? For the things I'm doing? Am I finding healthy ways to manage stress? But then also asking things like, well, what's happening in my life? Have I made any big changes recently, right? Did I start a new job? Did I take on more responsibilities? Did I agree? Did I say yes to too many things and now my plate is just crazy full? Are there any new stressors, right? Anything like that? Or, I have a kid that's getting married, or my grandson broke their bone, or whatever it is, right? What are the different things that might be playing into that? Um, like I mentioned for my friend, he's like, I noticed that whenever I travel, I tend to get sick, or I'm training way harder than normally, right? There's this just I added on a bunch of load, and part of it just goes, or a lot of it goes back to that principle of load versus capacity, right? How much am I asking of my body versus how much capacity does it have to handle it. And when we add physical load, right, like training, when we add on stress, anxiety, things like that to that, that can just it can cut into that capacity more, and we find ourselves getting injured. Um, Other things are like so. I was I was thinking about this. So it's funny because I've been thinking about this during the call. Um, this is like getting sick. So he mentioned one of the things was that like he often finds himself um, getting sick, right? And then his capacity is lower. And thought, obviously think about things about eating well, washing your hands often enough, but paying attention to the number of times, right? This goes to getting curious of like how often do I touch my face and eyes and mouth? Like I've done it several times during the call already, right? Scratch an itch here. And so even things that might seem unrelated, thinking about that, right? Well, what's playing into me getting sick so often? What's playing into XYZ happening so often? And so we've built an awareness, right, of some of the different factors, and then we've gotten curious about those things. And then it's time to experiment. And so, like, again, Terry, I think that's such a great example of I eat certain foods and I notice a difference in pain. And so, again, that's something that can be different for people, but often something that people find helpful is what we call an elimination diet, right? I notice, I feel like maybe there's something in what I'm eating that's playing into this. And so just kind of pulling things back and making the diet simpler, and then try to keep it like whole foods, lots of fruits and vegetables, and then starting to add things back in so you can experiment, right? What happens when I add dairy in? What happens when I add, certain types of meat in, or XYZ, or anything that you think you might be a little bit more sensitive to? And does that have a difference so that you're able to run these small experiments and get accurate data? Sometimes we want to change too many things at once, and that doesn't help us to problem solve. Um, and so definitely like there's a time and place for the testing, and then trying to address multiple things, especially when we have an injury, but starting to experiment with that. Um, oh man, I've noticed that my hip's starting to hurt, and I've been going on longer runs, or oh, I've been lifting a bunch more weight. Well, maybe drop the weight back down to what you were doing. Is the pain persisting, or did it go away? It went away. Okay, well I'll try adding on a little bit more weight, not as much as I did. I'll try adding a little bit of distance to my run, or a little bit more time on my feet, and then just doing it in smaller increments, and running those experiments again and again and again in different areas, so that we can find out what's what's going on, what's playing into things. Um, and with the experiment, we're always trying to bridge this gap from ideal to pragmatic, right? Like here's the theory, here's maybe the best exercises for this goal, or the best routine, or whatever it is, and pragmatic is what's actually working, right? What is sustainable over the long term. And there I go, touching my face again. What's sustainable over the long term? And so, for example, we'll talk about building muscle, right? So one of the things that's important for building muscle is you want to have enough volume, right? You're lifting enough weight often enough that it's signaling a change for adaptation, but you also want to have enough rest time between exercises for the best response. But in a world where time is limited and we have other responsibilities, it doesn't always make sense to get the exact amount of rest between sets that might lead to the most muscle growth. And so instead we maybe do a circuit routine where we still use our time really well, we're still getting the exercise in. Maybe the muscle growth response isn't as much, but it was something that we could do with the amount of time that we had, and it was something, we could do that circuit routine 2 or 3 times a week ad nauseum, right? And so any gap between the ideal growth actually ends up being smoothed out over time because we were able to do it consistently, right? And so when we're experimenting, just finding what's the combination of things that works for my life and my schedule that allows me to get these important things in, right? And going back, looking at the 5 patterns and that allow me to get quality and quantity of sleep, that allow me to get regular physical activity, that allow me to eat in a way that fuels my body well, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Figuring out what that gap is for you and trying different things. Um, and asking yourself the question, what are the trade-offs that I'm willing to accept? Because I think sometimes when we're trying to go towards any goal, we're like, I got to be perfect, I got to do this just right, and that often ends up being a recipe for failure. And so finding what are the trade-offs and what are the ones that I'm willing to make. And then last, I want to talk really quick about why tracking some of these different things, right? Why looking at your patterns regularly can be helpful. Obviously, to um, to track things, all of those patterns religiously every day with great detail, like that's a thing that's not sustainable. But regularly checking in and regularly getting curious, right? Asking yourself these different questions can be really helpful for avoiding injury over the long term. And we'll bring back the example of storms, right? So when we look at a forecast for, say, a hurricane, right? It's that kind of funnel shaped path, or I guess funnel shaped as you're getting closer to land, right? That funnel's really wide, maybe 4 or 5 days before it actually reaches land, right? And there's all these different paths, and so anywhere within this funnel is where the storm might land. And as you get closer and closer to land, right, the accuracy of where the storm's actually going to be gets better and better. And so if we were only to just check in, that 5 days out, it may go here, it may go here, it may hit here eventually, right? If we only collect the data that once, our accuracy of am I, are we doing the right things to prepare is going to be limited. So let's look at injury in the same way, right? If I only ever check in on those things, once in a blue moon, then I'm not going to have very good accuracy of am I making health decisions that are moving me in the right direction, right? We're not collecting enough data. And so you see this with injuries in sports actually pretty commonly, um, especially if you're looking like high school sports. Maybe they do a check-in of, like they look at your balance, maybe they test your strength, some different things at the beginning of the season, and then use that to gauge how you're doing the rest of the season, right? Oh, well, here's how they showed up. Versus if we checked in regularly, right? Well, how are you doing? Are you on track with your strength? What's balance looking at? What are some of these other factors? If we're checking in regularly and seeing how we're doing against those benchmarks, then we can see and make those micro adjustments to keep us, focusing in more and more and more. And so, again, just checking in regularly on each of those patterns and asking yourself those questions like, how am I doing here? Is there anything that I can change? Is there anything that needs to be improved? Are there things that I'm doing too much of? Are there things that I'm doing too little of? And how are you doing? That's why we, when we test metabolism, right? We don't just test it once ever and you're done. It's like the body, things are changing in the body as you train a certain way. Things are changing in the body. The same thing with the BSPI, right? When we do those functional exercise measures, we want to get that initial thing, and then how are we doing with progress here, right? Are you getting stronger? Are you getting more coordinated in this area? Have you gotten back the mobility in this area you needed, right? Do I have the ability to use my strength quickly? We want to check in on all those things regularly so that we can find any weak points. That was points is a mixture of spots and points. So there you go. You're welcome. New word. Um, and so anyway, so that we can just regularly update what we're doing and make sure that we're still moving in towards the path that's going to allow us to stay healthy now, but that's also setting the stage for us to be healthy and able 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And so it's it, it's not just one thing, obviously, as we talked about before, that's leading to our health, that's leading to injury. Often it's that kind of complex web of determinants, if you will, right? Different factors that are pouring in to the cup of injury to a later, lesser or greater degree. And so when we do regular audits on how we're doing and check in on our health regularly and adjust, make those micro adjustments, it's a lot easier to stay on top of things, and we do a lot better about seeing our risks for injury, right? And what do I need to modify now so that we don't have to wait until the injury happens to readjust, right? That we're checking in regularly. So one of the things, real quick before I end, is Cameron will talk a lot about heart rate, and he and I have both had this experience. Is we go out to do a run or a bike ride or whatever it is, and heart rate is just a lot higher that day. You know, usually I can run a little bit faster, and I keep this heart rate. And today I'm walking, or I'm walk jogging, and it's at that usual level. Well, that's a really good indicator that, hey, maybe I need to take it easier for today, or maybe the next couple of days. Often we observe changes in our heart rate before we get sick. And so instead of just being like, you know what, I just need to push through and push hard on this day and just whatever the heart rate says, and then, oh man, now I got that sore throat and I'm all congested and I felt right. Versus if we had have just looked at that metric and maybe made a different decision, said, you know what, I'm just going to take it a little bit easier today and we'll check in on this tomorrow. How am I doing? Okay, heart rate's back to normal. Great. Maybe that was just an anomaly. Or, you know what, it's still running high, so I'm going to keep it a little bit lighter, and we'll keep tracking this, and we'll keep adjusting and reviewing. And so just understanding that for most people, it's not when we get injury, when we get pain, it's not that we have a bad this or that. It's just that there's all these different things that play into it, and being aware of those, being curious about them, and experimenting with how do I modify some of those things can be really effective in helping us to avoid the storm of injury, if you will. All right, let's see. We got Christy typing something, so we'll wait on that. Like I'm just riffing on the same thing over and over again. But hopefully that's helpful in giving you a picture of what to look at and what to pay attention to when you have pain or injury. I'm grateful that you said that, Terry, of noticing a difference in pain, not necessarily injury, because again, it's not always injury. It's pain too, and just having an awareness and looking at those things can be really helpful. It'd be interesting while we're waiting to hear from Christy. Are there things that you find that you? Okay, yeah, we'll do that. So we'll go over that. It's like, are there things that you find as you reflect on it that tend to cluster when you get injured or when you have pain? So Terry mentioned food, right? My friend mentioned, oh, I'm doing a lot more training. I'm usually traveling, right? Sleep's not as great. What tend to be the things for you? So Christy asked, I want to know how long you have to wait before checking on your heart rate improvement for med tests. So on average, I would say uh, 10 weeks is probably a good amount of time. You can do sooner, you can space it out more. It just depends. If people are just really, really consistent and on point with doing the workouts as is, and there's not stuff getting in the way, right? Like sickness doesn't come up, or I've got to travel, and so things are going to be different. Sometimes as little as six weeks, um, but and then you can bridge it out 12 weeks, 18 weeks. So really probably somewhere in the 10 to 12 weeks, though, for most people is a good enough amount of time that there's some change occurred, um, and that it's actually going to be meaningful, right? So sometimes when we test it, every time you test it, there's going to be small variations, right? Maybe you got a little bit higher VO2 max, maybe your efficiency was a little bit different, but leaving enough space and time for the body to actually make adaptations. So most adaptations in our body, once we've started a specific type of training, take minimum 4 to 6 weeks. But especially when we're looking at changes in our bones, our tendons, changes in like blood vessel growth and mitochondria, right? How our body processes and uses energy. Those take a little bit longer for the effects to occur. And so just, yeah, it's really how giving that just physiologic time, right? How much time does it just take for adaptations to occur? And then kind of meshing that with how consistent have I been able to be is going to kind of shift that one way or another, if that helps. So Christy says, thank you. It's sometimes frustrating to do that low heart rate forever. So holding back is hard. It really is. And so like if you notice, it's just looking at trends. So when I say that, typically it's like for the past several weeks, I've been able to run at this, at this heart rate, at this pace. And now I'm running at this pace and my heart rate's shooting up, 10, 15, 20 beats a minute higher than normally. Like, again, this is a time, this is that going back to that principle of I have an awareness of this is happening. Let me get curious. What's maybe playing into this? How's my sleep been? Do I feel like I'm getting sick? Are there any new stressors? And then experimenting. Okay, if I do a couple days of lighter intensity and maybe focus on some of those things, and then I'm going to try that speed again. Okay, am I back up to that heart rate that I know, am I up to that higher heart rate, or am I kind of centering back around what's normal for me? And so it's just using some of those metrics as a stimulus to get curious about what's going on and to look at some of those other factors that might be playing in. So I think those are both great questions. Hopefully that covered that. All right, well, we're out of time. I've talked to you guys' ear off off enough for today. So thanks for joining. Hope this is helpful. Cameron gets back Tuesday, so I think we'll have Sam on the next Monday call. So anyway, we'll look forward to talking next on Monday, and we will plan on seeing you then. Thanks for joining, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Body Smart podcast. Join us in the Body Smart community on Facebook to share your successes or ask a question for our next episode. Now get out there and take the next step toward living your active lifestyle.